Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Depends how far. Ralvek Orrun had never met a species that could not be made to look slow. Some were strong, some were agile. A few could climb vertical stone faster than a Kethari could follow. There were gliding species, burrowing species, and one unpleasant amphibious civilization whose athletes could cross shallow water at speeds Ralvek considered personally offensive. But on open ground, speed belonged to the Kethari. It had for millions of years. Their ancestors had hunted across the sun-baked plains of Kethar by exploding from concealment and turning pursuit into a violent equation of distance, acceleration, and panic. Civilization had changed almost everything about how the Kethari lived. The legs remained. Ralvek stood 2 meters tall when fully upright, though Kethari runners leaned forward into a long digitigrade stride. Dense muscle ran from his hips into powerful spring tendons around the lower limbs. 2 vascular cooling crests lay flat along the back of his neck until exertion caused them to expand. On a short course, he could cross 100 meters faster than any human athlete alive. He had proved it often enough that the comparison had become part of his public identity. That mattered more than he liked admitting. Ralvek had grown up in a city where children raced between shade towers after school and old adults still argued over famous pursuit finals from decades earlier. His mother had been a regional coach. His older sister had held a provincial record before an ankle injury ended her competition career. At 14, Ralvek had discovered that he was not merely fast by local standards. He was exceptional. By 20, he was a professional athlete. By 28, he was the face commentators used when explaining Kethari locomotion to other species. He enjoyed the fame. He also resented the way every loss became a question about his species instead of his day. The challenge began after a sporting exhibition on Kalora. Ralvek had just won the interspecies pursuit final when he saw a human coming through the finish gate of an endurance event. The man was not sprinting. By Kethari standards, he was barely moving. His name, according to the display, was Galen Talbot. Galen's shirt had darkened with sweat. Dust covered his calves. His face was red from exertion, and the race clock showed he had been on the course for hours. Yet after crossing the line, the human did not collapse. He walked for several minutes, accepted water, ate something from a small packet, and began talking with another competitor as if he had merely completed an inconvenient commute. Ralvek approached because he was curious. "Human," he called. Galen turned, still drinking. Ralvek pointed toward the course. "You call that racing?" Galen looked at the finish clock, then at Ralvek's medal, and finally at Ralvek himself. "Depends how far we're going." Several nearby athletes heard him, so did the cameras. Ralvek's jaw plates shifted into the Kethari equivalent of a smile. Far enough that excuses become difficult. Galen wiped sweat from his forehead. "How far is that?" Kethari competitive pursuits rarely exceeded 20 kilometers. Elite endurance events sometimes went farther, but they included planned cooling intervals. Human athletes routinely covered much greater distances, so Ralvek chose a number intended to remove ambiguity. 50 kilometers. The people around them went quiet. Galen did not. He glanced toward the nearby terrain projection showing the Valen Expanse, a mixed grass and stone reserve used for interspecies athletics. "On that course." "If you accept." Galen asked about temperature, humidity, and elevation in quick succession. Ralvek answered that midday would reach roughly 26 degrees, the air would be dry, and the course carried moderate elevation changes. Galen nodded slowly. Ralvek expected negotiation after that, perhaps a shorter distance, a cooler start, or a flatter route. Instead, the human asked, "Where are the water stations?" Someone nearby laughed. Ralvek looked toward the sound, then back at Galen. "You require scheduled water." "Yeah, every 5 kilometers would be comfortable," Galen said. "More often late if it gets warmer." A Kethari reporter made an amused clicking sound. The human had been challenged to a race and immediately begun discussing drinking. Ralvek assured him that race regulations allowed as much water as he required. Galen followed by asking about electrolytes and food, and Ralvek's confidence increased with every question. "You intend to eat during the race?" he asked. "Probably." Ralvek studied him. "How much equipment do you require to run?" Galen looked back. "Less than I require to stop." Ralvek's jaw plates widened. That was a good answer. "Then you accept." Galen extended one hand. Ralvek had learned the gesture and clasped it. "Sure," the human said. 50 kilometers, warm and dry, water every 5. "Yes." Galen smiled. "Sounds fun." Ralvek looked at the human's tired legs. He had just watched the creature run slowly for hours. The galaxy would finally see exactly how exaggerated humanity's reputation for endurance had become. Chapter 2. The Human's Race. Galen Talbot was not the fastest human at Kalora. Ralvek learned that within a day, and for reasons he could not explain, the fact irritated him. The human had never represented Earth in a major championship. He held no famous sprint records. His 50-kilometer times were respectable rather than historic. The sporting networks described him as an experienced endurance specialist, which sounded like polite language for someone who had become very good at refusing to stop. Then Ralvek read more. Galen was 39. He had grown up on a dry agricultural colony in Western Australia before spending 12 years as a civilian survey engineer. Much of his work had involved long days on foot across mining concessions, geological reserves, and half-developed colony sites where vehicles could not always reach. He had started running seriously in his 20s because, according to one interview, walking all day made running after work seem less stupid than it should have. His first ultra-distance race had gone badly. He had started too fast, eaten too little, cramped at 32 kilometers, and spent the final hour discovering how many different parts of a human foot could hurt simultaneously. He had returned the next year. The second attempt had gone better because he had learned to drink before thirst became urgent, eat before hunger became weakness, and slow down before fatigue forced the decision for him. Ralvek read the line twice. Slow down before fatigue forced the decision. That was not a philosophy a Kethari athlete would place on a poster. Galen's training footage was equally unimpressive until Ralvek realized what he was looking at. The human rarely produced dramatic sessions. He ran long distances at controlled effort. He walked steep climbs without embarrassment. He practiced eating while moving. He weighed himself before and after hot weather runs to estimate fluid loss. He kept notes about shoes, blisters, stomach tolerance, temperature, sleep, and pace. There was no secret technique. There was paperwork. Ralvek's coach, Enor, found him reviewing the footage late one evening. "You are studying him more than you studied the pursuit final," Enor observed. "I already understood the pursuit final." "And you do not understand this." Ralvek gestured at the screen, where Galen was jogging up a dusty road while carrying a water pack. "He trains to become tired." Enor considered that. "So do you." "I train to remain fast while tired." "Perhaps he trains to remain functional while tired." Ralvek did not like the distinction. He closed the file. His own preparation remained straightforward. The 50-kilometer distance was unusual for Kethari competition, but not biologically impossible. Ralvek had completed long pursuit simulations before. He understood heat management, hydration, pacing, and recovery. He would not sprint the opening kilometers like an animal following instinct. He would race intelligently, establish a lead, reduce speed, use the cooling stations. Make the human spend the entire day staring at empty course. Simple, the public treated the contest as a species argument anyway. Human networks ran features about endurance. Kethari networks ran features about speed. Commentators found ancient hunting footage, modern biomechanics studies, and enough simplified evolutionary graphics to irritate every serious scientist involved. Galen seemed mostly amused by it. When a reporter asked whether he felt pressure to prove something about humanity, the human shook his head. "I'm running one race against one guy," he said. "If I have a bad day, humans don't stop being humans." Ralvek heard the answer and unexpectedly respected it. He wished his own people thought that way. Chapter 3. The Favorite. Dr. Savaidoran ruined the prediction show. Ralvek had expected commentators to discuss his speed. Instead, the comparative physiologist spent 20 minutes talking about sweat. The race had drawn enormous interest across the sporting networks. Ralvek was already famous. Galen became famous because humans were remarkably good at turning mildly irresponsible competitions into public events. Savai was avorin, a species evolved in high-altitude forests with little personal investment in terrestrial running. That made her useful as a neutral expert. The presenter asked for her prediction. "Ralvek should establish a substantial early lead," Savai said. Ralvek nodded at the display. "Correct. Will he win?" She paused. That annoyed him. The presenter leaned forward. You sound uncertain. I am. Why? Temperature. Ralvek's jaw plates tightened. 26 degrees was not extreme. Both competitors had trained in warmer environments. Savai brought up two anatomical models. The Kethari model highlighted the vascular cooling crests along the neck and upper spine. Kethari can move heat efficiently while resting or operating at moderate load, she explained. Their respiratory cooling is also excellent. This permits rapid recovery after intense pursuit. Ralvek approved so far. But prolonged high muscular output creates a trade-off. Blood used for heat transfer is blood not being used elsewhere, and respiratory cooling becomes increasingly expensive at sustained racing intensity. The human model highlighted next. Sweat glands appeared across almost the entire skin surface. Humans use another method. They are willing to lose water continuously. The presenter looked confused. Willing. The physiology is not making a conscious decision, but functionally, yes. Humans spend water to remove heat through evaporation. Ralvek already knew humans sweated. Most informed athletes knew that. Does that not cause dehydration? The presenter asked. Absolutely. Which is why Talbot's first question was about water. That irritated Ralvek more than it should have. Savai continued before the show could turn the point into mythology. This does not make humans immune to heat. They can overheat. They can dehydrate. They can develop electrolyte problems. Their muscles fatigue, their feet fail, and their stomachs can stop tolerating food. Talbot has multiple ways to lose this race. Would you favor him? Not yet. Ralvek is not an untrained wild predator. He understands pacing and heat management. If he races intelligently, the Kethari speed advantage remains enormous. Ralvek relaxed. Then Savai added, but if Ralvek buys too much speed early, he may discover that the human is using a different currency. Ralvek paused the recording. He stared at Savai's frozen face. Then he resumed training. He did not intend to sprint 50 kilometers like an idiot. The night before the event, another network interviewed Galen. The human sat with a hydration pack beside him while taping two toes that had blistered during training. The reporter asked whether he expected to keep pace with Ralvek at the start. Galen laughed. No. What if he builds a large lead? He will. Does that concern you? No. Why? Galen adjusted the tape, because trying to run his race would be stupid. Ralvek listened. That answer he respected. At least the contest would not require delusion. Chapter 4. The start. Ralvek destroyed him. There was no more accurate description of the first 10 kilometers. The starting signal sounded across the Valen expanse and Ralvek accelerated. Not maximally. He had promised himself restraint. His opening pace was more than 20% below what he could sustain in a shorter competition. It was still enough to make Galen vanish behind him. The first kilometer crossed level grassland. Ralvek settled into a controlled rhythm, his long stride eating distance while his breathing remained easy. Crowd drones paced him overhead. At the 1 kilometer marker, he glanced back. The human was already distant. Ralvek laughed. Enor's voice came through the permitted one-way race monitor. Do not get excited. I am not. You sound excited. I sound fast. You are fast, that is the problem. Ralvek reduced pace slightly. By 3 kilometers, Galen had disappeared behind a low rise. At 5, Ralvek reached the first water station. His body temperature had risen only modestly, so he took a small amount of electrolyte fluid and continued. He did not need more. 5 kilometers later, the gap had become absurd. Spectators along the course reacted as if the result were already decided. Ralvek knew better. 50 kilometers was long, and he was not foolish. At 10 kilometers, he deliberately slowed. His muscles felt excellent. Breathing remained easy. Cooling crests had only partially opened. At the 12-kilometer ridge, he finally caught sight of Galen again, crossing the flats far behind. Ralvek expected to see strain or a desperate attempt to close the gap. Instead, the human looked exactly as he had at the start. Same short stride, same cadence, same upright posture. Galen did not appear to care that he was losing. That was strange. Competition required awareness of your opponent. Galen seemed to be competing against the ground. Ralvek turned forward. Humans were odd. He already knew that. What he did not know was that Galen had made almost the opposite calculation. The human saw Ralvek disappear in the opening kilometer and felt relief. There would be no temptation to race beside him. Galen had learned that lesson years earlier during his first ultradistance event. He remembered the exhilaration of passing people in the opening hour, the confidence of running faster than planned because faster still felt easy, and the miserable arithmetic of paying for every unnecessary minute later. So he checked his breathing, ignored the crowd drones, and settled into the effort he had trained. At 5 kilometers, he drank before thirst appeared. At 10, he ate a small portion of carbohydrate before hunger existed. He did not need either urgently. That was the point. He had learned to solve endurance problems before they became emergencies. Chapter 5. Sweat. At 15 kilometers, Ralvek noticed the heat. It was not dangerous. It was simply present. The sun had climbed and the dry grassland reflected warmth upward. His cooling crests expanded fully. Respiratory rate increased slightly, still within comfort. He drank more at the next station and used one of the Kethari cooling wraps provided under race rules. Cold fluid passed over the external crests for several seconds. Excellent. He left before his heart rate dropped substantially. No wasted time. Behind him, Galen reached the previous station. The live feed appeared on a course display, and Ralvek glanced at it while running. The human was wet, completely. Sweat darkened his shirt from shoulders to waist. Moisture shone on his arms and face. He grabbed a bottle, drank, poured a little over his head, accepted another flask, and kept moving. A Kethari spectator beside the course made a concerned noise. Is he ill? Ralvek almost laughed. Savai's voice came through the course speakers. No, the sweating is normal. The presenter sounded doubtful. He is losing that much fluid deliberately. His body is. That seems inefficient. It is expensive. Then why do it? Because water can be replaced. Heat cannot always be removed as quickly. Ralvek listened despite himself. The human crossed the station without stopping. He walked perhaps 10 steps while drinking, then resumed the same pace. Ralvek turned away. He was still kilometers ahead. At 20 kilometers, the lead remained comfortable. Yet for the first time, it had stopped growing. Ralvek did not panic. He adjusted. His internal thermal monitor showed a higher temperature than planned for this stage, but still well within safe limits. He shortened stride, reduced speed, moved closer to shaded terrain, and increased fluid intake. The lead was large enough. There was no reason to pay for unnecessary speed. Enor approved. Good adjustment. I know. Then stop sounding offended. I am not offended. You are racing a creature that looks slower than warm resin, and somehow this bothers you. Ralvek's jaw plates tightened. His coach knew him too well. Chapter 6. Sustainable. At 25 kilometers, Ralvek reached the midpoint station and allowed himself a longer cooling stop. 40 extra seconds was nothing. The lead could absorb it. While the cold bands worked across his crests, a race drone showed Galen approaching the steep ridge behind him. The human did something unexpected. He walked. Ralvek blinked, then watched more carefully. Galen had not staggered or collapsed. He had simply switched to a purposeful walking stride. The crowd reacted. Some spectators cheered while others assumed the human was finally failing. Ralvek smiled. Then Galen reached the top, took water, swallowed a small carbohydrate packet while still moving, and began running again. Same pace. Ralvek's smile disappeared. The human had not broken. He had simply decided that running the steepest portion cost more energy than the small time gain justified. Ralvek understood the decision. He disliked it. Galen had learned that lesson on a 48-kilometer desert race 6 years earlier. He had once tried to maintain running form up every climb because walking felt like surrender. The result had been impressive photographs and a disastrous final 12 kilometers. His coach at the time, a retired expedition medic named Lena Qureshi, had made him write one sentence at the top of his training log afterward. The course does not care what movement looks like. Galen had hated the sentence. He had also never forgotten it. At 27 kilometers, Enor spoke into Ralvek's monitor. The projected finish times are converging. Ralvek's head lifted. How much? Not enough to concern you yet. That was not an answer. Your pace has fallen 19% from the opening 10 kilometers. Deliberately. Yes. Talbot. 4%. Ralvek said nothing. He opened slower, Enor reminded him. I know. He is still slower. I know. Then run your race. Ralvek focused forward. That phrase suddenly annoyed him because Galen was doing exactly that. Chapter 7. Behind him. At 30 kilometers, Ralvek looked back. The human was visible. That should not have mattered. Galen remained far behind, but he had not been visible 10 kilometers earlier. Now he was, a small figure moving beneath the white sun. Ralvek continued. 2 minutes later, he looked again, still there. His instincts reacted before his intellect did. The answer they supplied was immediate: increase the distance. Predators did not like being followed. Ralvek accelerated. The sensation was wonderful. His stride opened, power flowed, and the course began passing beneath him the way it was supposed to. Spectators roared as the gap widened. For almost a kilometer, Ralvek remembered what superiority felt like. Then his thermal warning changed color, not danger, caution. His temperature had climbed too quickly. Ralvek immediately slowed. Frustration flashed through him because the speed had been available. His muscles could still produce it. His lungs could still feed them. His legs felt powerful. But his body had somewhere else to put the waste heat, and that somewhere was already becoming crowded. He dropped back to his planned endurance pace. Cooling crests throbbed. Respiration deepened. Temperature stabilized slowly. Behind him, Galen kept coming, not quickly, but with the same persistent rhythm. That was the disturbing part. If the human had surged, Ralvek could have respected the attack. Instead, Galen simply remained what he had been from the opening kilometer. Slow, steady, and still present. Ralvek looked back again. It occurred to him that, from the human's perspective, almost nothing had changed. Ralvek was the one whose race kept changing. At 32 kilometers, Savai's commentary came through the course speakers. The presenter asked why Galen had not accelerated despite the shrinking gap. He probably cannot do so without increasing his own risk, Savai answered. Ralvek appreciated that. The human had limits too. Then why is he gaining? Because Ralvek is slowing. A less pleasant answer. The presenter asked, is the human winning now? No, Ralvek remains ahead and still possesses substantial speed reserve. Good, Savai paused, but that reserve is becoming thermally expensive. Ralvek ignored the rest. He did not need a physiologist explaining his own neck crests to him. The next cooling station was 3 kilometers ahead. He would stop, cool thoroughly, and finish the last 15 kilometers conservatively. The strategy remained sound. Chapter 8. The station. Ralvek reached the 35-kilometer station with his warning indicator still in caution. He hated stopping. He did it anyway. Competitiveness was not permission to become stupid. The cooling area had been designed specifically for Kethari physiology. A technician wrapped both vascular crests in circulating cold bands while Ralvek drank slowly. His heart hammered. Temperature began dropping. Enor spoke through the monitor. Stay until green. I know. You are staring at the course. I am aware. Stay. Ralvek paced beneath the canopy. Every instinct urged him forward. The medical indicator remained yellow. He looked back and saw nothing. Good. Then a crowd farther down the course began making noise and Ralvek's body went still. A figure appeared around the bend. It was the human, soaked with sweat, shoulders slightly lower than before, stride shorter and face tight, but still running. Ralvek stared. No. Enor said nothing. Galen approached the station. Ralvek could hear his breathing now, hard but rhythmic. Human feet struck the course in quick, repetitive steps. The human entered the shade and saw Ralvek. His expression changed. Surprise, that almost made it worse. A volunteer handed Galen a bottle. He drank while walking. Another passed him a soft flask containing carbohydrates and electrolytes. Galen swallowed some, accepted a second bottle, and poured part over his head. Water ran down his face. Ralvek stood beneath active cooling equipment. The human looked at him. You good? Ralvek stared. Galen waited perhaps half a second, then nodded to himself. Cool. He started running again. Ralvek watched him cross the timing line and disappear beyond the station. His thermal monitor turned green. Enor said very quietly, you can go. Ralvek tore the cooling wraps away and ran. Chapter 9. The chase. Catching Galen was easy. That almost made the situation unbearable. Ralvek accelerated from the station and erased the human's small lead within minutes. Galen looked back once, saw him, and changed nothing. Ralvek passed fast enough to make the point deliberately. He wanted Galen to understand the difference between them. The human's expression suggested he already did. Ralvek opened 100 meters, then 200. His thermal reading began rising. He reduced pace. Galen remained behind. The next section crossed open stone with no shade. Heat shimmered above the ground. Ralvek's crests were fully expanded and his breath came harder. He maintained a pace barely faster than Galen's for another 10 minutes. Then caution returned. Ralvek slowed further. Footsteps approached from behind him. Small, rhythmic, relentless, Galen came alongside. This time the human looked worse. Good, sweat covered him, salted dried white along his shirt. His stride was no longer perfectly symmetrical, and he favored one foot slightly. Ralvek could smell carbohydrate gel, sweat, and dust. The human was hurting. Ralvek found that reassuring. Galen glanced over. "You've got a hell of a top gear." Ralvek breathed hard through his open cooling passages. "You are very slow." Galen laughed once. It sounded painful. "Yeah." Then he moved ahead. Ralvek waited for his temperature to fall and accelerated again. He passed Galen on the next shallow descent. 5 minutes later, he had to slow. The human came back. No triumph, no insult, just footsteps. Ralvek understood the geometry now. He could always go faster. The problem was that faster had become something he could only afford briefly. Galen's pace was not impressive. His refusal to lose it was becoming terrifying. Chapter 10. The Human Breaks. At 40 kilometers, Galen finally looked mortal. Ralvek had been waiting for it. The human reached a water station and stopped running completely. He bent forward with both hands on his thighs while a race medic spoke to him. Ralvek approached at a walk, cooling crests burning hot. Hope surged. Galen took several controlled breaths, shook his head at the medic's question, accepted water, and ate another carbohydrate packet. Ralvek entered the station. His own thermal monitor remained yellow, so he moved beneath the cooling bands. Galen stood upright slowly. His face had gone pale beneath the redness. He flexed one foot and grimaced, blister perhaps. His stomach also appeared unsettled. Good, not because Ralvek wished him harm, because physics was finally remembering Galen existed. Ralvek said, "You are failing." Galen looked over, tired. "You stopped. At a water station. You have been slowing." "Yep." Ralvek's jaw plates widened. "Then the race is not finished." Galen took another drink, wasn't planning on it. The human walked out of the station. Ralvek's confidence returned. Then, 50 meters later, Galen began jogging, slowly. Within another 100 meters, he was back near his previous cadence. Ralvek's confidence suffered a complicated injury. Savai's commentary played from nearby speakers. "Talbot is clearly struggling now," the presenter said. "Yes," Savai agreed. "Does that change your projection?" "Of course." The human is accumulating muscular damage, losing fuel and probably developing foot pain. Sweating does not make him immune to fatigue. His internal energy stores are finite, and he has to keep replacing fluid. If his stomach stops cooperating or his pace collapses, Ralvek can still win. Excellent, then what is the human advantage? Savai paused. He can manage many of those problems while moving. Ralvek's confidence deteriorated again. His monitor turned green. He left the station. 9.5 kilometers remained. By every instinct his species possessed, 9 kilometers was a short distance. Ralvek would make it short. Chapter 11. Old Hunts. The next ridge was steep. Ralvek climbed quickly. Even fatigued, his hind limbs drove him upward with power Galen could not match. He gained distance. At the top, Ralvek looked back. The human was walking again, which pleased Ralvek until he noticed how Galen was doing it. The pace was fast and purposeful. There was no collapse and no hands on knees, only a long, economical stride. Ralvek understood. The slope demanded too much energy for the human's running speed to justify itself, so Galen had changed gait again. No pride, no loyalty to the appearance of racing, only movement. At the ridge station, a large display carried the network broadcast. Savai was answering a question about human evolutionary history. Ralvek normally disliked simplistic discussions of predator ancestry. Modern beings were not their ancestors, and every species deserved better than being reduced to one prehistoric adaptation. Still, he listened. "Human supporters keep using the phrase persistence hunter," the presenter said. "Is that accurate?" Savai answered carefully. Some human populations historically used forms of persistence hunting, particularly in warm environments. Human evolutionary history is much more complicated than one hunting strategy. Ralvek approved. Finally, someone had sense. But the relevant point here is simpler, Savai continued. Humans possess a collection of traits and behaviors that make sustained locomotion in heat unusually effective. A hunter using that strategy would not need to outrun prey every minute. Then what would it need? Savai watched Galen climbing on her monitor, for the prey to stop first. Ralvek turned away from the screen. He suddenly hated evolutionary biology. Then he caught himself. That was not what was happening here. Galen was not hunting him. Ralvek was not prey. Neither athlete had been forced into this race by biology. They had shaken hands in front of cameras because both of them wanted to know what would happen. The realization steadied him. Ralvek had spent too much of the course defending an ancestral metaphor. He needed to finish a race. Chapter 12. 8 kilometers. 8 kilometers remained when Ralvek finally stopped trying to make a point. He did calculations. He knew his sustainable pace at the current temperature. He knew how much cooling he could gain at the final station. He knew Galen was slowing. The human had lost perhaps 10% from his starting pace. Ralvek could win. No more emotional surges, no more attempts to prove speed. He would manage heat, run just fast enough, cool once, and finish. The plan worked for 3 kilometers. Ralvek maintained distance. His temperature climbed slowly. Galen remained behind. The course descended across an open grass plain, and the finish complex was now visible far away. Ralvek's body hurt, but the pain was manageable. His legs remained powerful. His breathing remained controlled. For the first time in half an hour, he believed the race was becoming his again. Then the wind died. Ralvek felt the change immediately. Airflow over his cooling crests decreased. Heat transfer dropped. Temperature began climbing faster. A tiny environmental change, nothing dramatic. For Galen, the dry air still allowed evaporation. His sweat continued doing its work. Ralvek opened his respiratory passages wider. Cooling increased, but so did effort. His pace dropped, not much, enough. He heard the human behind him. Ralvek did not look, looking accomplished nothing. Footsteps grew louder. Galen came alongside. His face looked terrible. Ralvek felt briefly encouraged. Then the human said, "Wind quit." "Yes. Bad for you." Ralvek looked at him. "Runt." Galen's mouth twitched. "That bad, huh?" Ralvek increased speed. Galen did not follow immediately. The Kethari opened another gap. His thermal monitor changed to yellow. Ralvek held the pace, temperature rising, still safe. The finish was 6 kilometers away. He could make 6 kilometers short. The monitor chirped again, high caution. Enor spoke immediately. "Back down." "I know. You will reach critical threshold if you hold that." "I know." Ralvek slowed. Galen passed him 30 seconds later. Neither spoke. Ralvek watched the hydration pack bouncing slightly with each human step. Water. The human had brought water because he intended to spend it. Ralvek had laughed. So had half the galaxy. Now he understood why Galen had asked about it before almost anything else. Chapter 13. The last station. 5 kilometers remained. Galen reached the final station first and stopped running. Ralvek felt hope for half a heartbeat until he saw what the human was doing. Galen was refilling, drinking, taking fuel, and letting a volunteer pour water over the back of his neck while he walked through the station. He never sat. He never entered shade longer than necessary. Ralvek arrived perhaps a minute later. His body screamed for cooling. He knew the correct decision. He hated it. Ralvek stopped beneath the canopy and let the cold bands close around his crests. Galen looked back. Their eyes met. The human was visibly wrecked. Ralvek could see pain in every movement, shortened stride, stiff ankles, slight bend at the waist. Galen was not an effortless biological machine. He was exhausted and still leaving. Enor said, "Stay." Ralvek watched Galen disappear around the bend. His entire ancestry objected. A prey animal did not walk away while the predator rested. Except Galen was not prey, and Ralvek was tired of being trapped by the metaphor. The monitor remained yellow. Ralvek growled. "Stay," Enor repeated. "I heard you. You are thinking about leaving." "I am always thinking about leaving." "Then think more slowly." Ralvek almost laughed. The indicator shifted. Green, 5 kilometers, Kethari distance, his distance. Ralvek accelerated. Chapter 14. Predator. For the next kilometer, Ralvek became what the galaxy expected. Not merely fast, but truly fast. His exhausted body still possessed frightening power. His legs stretched into full pursuit stride, finished drones altered course to follow, and the broadcast crowd erupted. Ralvek saw Galen ahead. The human looked back. His face changed. Ralvek closed the gap with every stride. 300 meters became 200, then 100. Galen did not accelerate, perhaps because he could not. Ralvek came within 50 meters, then 30. His thermal monitor screamed. This was no longer caution, it was danger. Ralvek's body temperature had crossed the limit his medical team established before the race. He could maintain the surge, his muscles would do it, his heart would do it, his lungs would do it. For a while, the risk was no longer sport. Ralvek slowed. The decision hurt more than anything else in the race. He dropped from pursuit stride to a jog, then finally to a walk. His cooling crests pulsed painfully. Respiration came in deep, rapid cycles. Galen looked back again. This time the human stopped. Ralvek's head snapped up. No. Galen stared. Ralvek pointed forward. Go. The human hesitated, then nodded. He resumed running. Ralvek walked while his temperature slowly declined. The human became smaller ahead of him. For once, Ralvek did not feel like a predator watching prey escape. He felt like an athlete watching someone execute the race he had promised to run from the beginning. Galen had never tried to be faster. Ralvek had spent nearly 50 kilometers waiting for that to matter. It never had. Chapter 15. Finish. Galen Talbot crossed the finish line at a speed Ralvek would once have mocked. Nobody mocked it now. The human staggered after the timing gate. Volunteers caught him, handed him water, and kept him walking in a small circle because human endurance coaches disliked sudden complete stops after long races. Finally, Galen sat on the ground. His legs shook. He peeled one shoe off and stared at a blister with deep personal betrayal. Dr. Savai reached him with the medical team. Human was exhausted, mildly dehydrated, low on readily available energy, and hurting from his feet through his cramped quadriceps. Salt stained his clothing. He had not conquered 50 kilometers effortlessly. He had simply arrived first. Ralvek crossed later, still running. His final recovery had allowed him to resume a moderate pace, and the crowd rose when he entered the finish corridor. Ralvek heard them. He appreciated it. He crossed the line and went directly into the cooling shelter. Cold circulation bands closed around his crests while a technician sprayed water across the vascular membranes. For several minutes, neither athlete spoke. Eventually, Galen appeared outside the shelter. He had put his shoe back on badly and carried 2 bottles. He offered one. Ralvek accepted. They drank while the cameras remained at a respectful distance. Ralvek finally said, "You knew." Galen lowered the bottle. "Knew what?" "That I would overheat." The human shook his head. "No." Ralvek's crests tightened. "You prepared specifically for heat. You asked about water." "Because I need water." "You knew." Galen smiled tiredly. "I hoped." Ralvek stared. "I knew you were faster," Galen continued. "I knew it would be warm. I knew I could probably hold my pace if I stayed fed and hydrated. Everything after that was your problem." Ralvek considered the answer. It sounded almost insulting. It was not. It was simply accurate. "I was faster than you," Ralvek said. "Yep. By an enormous amount." "Yep. I ran most sections of the course at a higher speed." Galen drank again. "Probably." "And I lost." Galen looked toward Ralvek's cooling crests. "You had to cool down." Ralvek waited for an explanation. The human did not provide one. Good. Ralvek had spent 50 kilometers receiving it. After a while, Galen asked, "You okay with losing?" Ralvek considered lying. "No." Galen laughed. Ralvek added, "But I am okay with the reason." "That's usually the useful part." The Kethari looked at him. "You have lost many races." "Plenty." "And returned." "Usually." Ralvek finally understood something else about the human that the physiology broadcasts had missed. Endurance was not merely the ability to continue during one race. Sometimes it was the willingness to learn from an ugly one and come back anyway. Chapter 16. 5 kilometers. Ralvek reviewed the race obsessively for 3 days. Enor told him to stop. He did not. He studied thermal curves, pace, hydration, wind, cooling intervals, Galen's carbohydrate intake, Galen's walking periods, and every one of his own unnecessary surges. He discovered several places where a smaller early lead would probably have improved his final result. That mattered. The loss had not been inevitable. Good. Ralvek preferred problems that could be trained. He contacted Dr. Savai and they discussed improved cooling strategies for Kethari endurance sport. He contacted Enor and they designed a more conservative long-distance program. He also spoke to his sister, who watched the entire race from Kethar. She waited until he had finished explaining the thermal data and said, You chased him when you saw him behind you, didn't you? Ralvek stared at the communicator. That is not a technical analysis. No, it's what Mother said you would do. Ralvek ended that conversation earlier than his sister preferred. Then he contacted Galen. The human answered from a recovery pool and immediately told Ralvek he looked terrible. Ralvek's jaw plates widened. You look submerged. It's called recovery. I want a rematch. Galen became interested at once and asked whether Ralvek wanted the same course, a warmer day, or an even longer distance. Ralvek rejected all three suggestions. 5 kilometers. The human stared at him long enough for Ralvek to enjoy the silence. You bastard, Galen finally said. Ralvek's crests lifted. You accept. Galen thought about it, then laughed. Sure, I'm going to lose, but sure. That attitude is concerning. It's accurate. Ralvek proposed 1 week. Galen demanded 2 because, as he put it, his feet still hated Ralvek. They settled on 2. Galen started closing the connection, but Ralvek stopped him. Human. What? Ralvek remembered the first challenge, the laughter, the hydration pack, and the water stations. He showed his teeth. Bring water. Galen stared for half a second, then laughed so hard the connection shook. Ralvek closed the channel, smiling. 5 kilometers. This time, the human was going to learn exactly what speed meant.